What's up, guys? Welcome back to another episode of Katson's Corner, the show where we talk about the NFL draft from a Chargers perspective. This week, we're going to talk about the NFL Combine, which gets started in earnest next week on Thursday with the beginning of on-field testing for the defensive line and linebackers. Technically speaking, the on-field stuff starts on Wednesday with the kicking workout, but that part I don't believe is televised. And even more technically speaking, the combine actually starts on Sunday when all the players arrive and they start doing team interviews. At least the first group of players arrive and start doing team interviews. I will be live in Indianapolis from Tuesday to Sunday. I'll have plenty of intel that comes through, as well as all of my regular reporting and stuff that I do. So make sure you're tuned in for that. For all of that stuff, you can find it on my social media accounts, which are pretty much all at Alex Katson, the same way you see it spelled on the screen. On Blue Sky, it's just at Katson, Katson, if you were looking for me there. We are going to talk this week about some guys who I think at the end of the combine will be a much larger part of the discourse around this draft class than they are coming in. I hesitate to use the word riser or winner when talking about the combine because really there are no risers and there are no winners at the NFL combine. If you think a guy is a great athlete and then he shows up and he tests as a great athlete, that player should not be moving up your board because you already knew that he was a great athlete. And so if you move him up again for testing super well at the combine, you're effectively double counting the fact that he's a great athlete. And so when this week ends, you're probably going to see someone like Michigan defensive tackle Kenneth Grant on a lot of risers lists, right? And he's someone that we've talked about on the show before, someone that a lot of people think is going to be a prime option for the Chargers at 22, including him himself, according to a media member that I talked to at the Shrine Bowl, right? And I think you're going to see him on a lot of lists. People are going to talk about there's no way he gets out of the top 15, yada, 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 et cetera, right? Because he's going to run sub 4.9 in the 40 probably. He's going to test out of the gym in pretty much every area. That's all going to be great. It's going to be so much fun to watch him do all of that. I'm super excited to see Kenneth Grant at the combine. It is not going to change my evaluation of him as a player because I already know he's a great athlete. We've known since at least this fall that he's a fantastic athlete. He was on Bruce Feldman's freaks list. He is like that athleticism shows up on his tape. It's very evident when you watch him that he's a super athletic guy for being 350 pounds. It's not going to affect the way that I think about him, right? And so that's not really the exercise that we're going through today. We're not going to talk about a guy like that because I don't think that he's going to rise past where we're already all talking about him, right? Like you don't move up the board for stuff like that. It's much more of an exclusionary event where if you think a guy's a great athlete and then he shows up and he tests poorly, then you have to go back and you have to determine why it was that you thought he was going to test like a great athlete. I think a great example of this is Bucky Irving last year, right? Where when you watch the Oregon tape, he looked like a perfectly fine athlete. I think good athlete is probably the term that I would use, right? And then he showed up to the combine and he tested pretty poorly across the board. And I know that a lot of people think that his RAS was weighed down by the fact that he's so small. But if you look at the way that he tested in a lot of metrics, really the only thing that he came in at average or above average at was the 40, and everything else was pretty much below average across the board. And so you have to go back and you have to say, like, why did I think he was such a great athlete when I watched the Oregon tape, right? And that does push him down the board a little bit, right? And when I talk about the board, I'm talking about the media consensus board, essentially, because NFL teams have already completed all of their evaluations. The combine is just it's a confirmation point, it's a checkbox for them. The much more important part of it is the stuff that happens behind the scenes that none of us see on TV. And even like people like me don't see there in person at the event because it takes place behind closed doors in the team meetings with all of those sessions, right? Like maybe we'll see it on Hard Knocks or something like that, but that's like the most you get, right? And so the media board is going to be influenced by what happens this week. NFL team boards, not so much, other than interviews and stuff, right? But these guys that we're going to talk about are guys that I think are going to be moving up media boards if they perform well at the combine, who I am already a little bit higher on than the current consensus. So, with all those disclaimers out of the way, I know you guys are not here to listen to me rant about the utility of the combine as an actual event. So, let's get started. We're going to start with Texas running back Jaden Blue. He's 6 foot, 190 pounds. Was supposed to be at the Shrine Bowl, did not appear for some behind the scenes reasons that I can't really get into too much without exposing people that I talk to, which would get me fired. So wasn't at the Shrine Bowl. We'll just go with that. Was kind of a surprise declaration, in a really stacked running back class. He's only a redshirt sophomore, and so a lot of people, including myself, were not expecting him to be in this draft class. And for that reason, a lot of people still really aren't talking about him in this draft class. And the people that have watched him and the people that have been talking about him that I've talked to as we kind of get ready for this week, I've talked to some people that have him as high as like running back 6, right? And so and then like you talk to someone like NFL Network's Daniel Jeremiah, who did his yearly conference call with the media earlier today as I'm recording this, probably yesterday as you're watching this on hopefully Friday morning or afternoon. And Daniel Jeremiah listed Blue along with UCF running back RJ Harvey as two guys that he thinks could be gems in this running back class in like round 3 or later, right? And so when you look at a guy like this, super slippery runner, he's an elite receiver, like I think is a perfect back for the modern NFL. Exactly what teams are looking for now. If you're looking for like a Jahmyr Gibbs type player, like that same sort of impact on an offense, I think that you can talk yourself into that impact with Gibbs, right? He's got high end top speed. He's an explosive play threat pretty much anytime he touches the ball. I do think that he needs to be a little bit more efficient with his feet. He really is content to stutter his feet a little bit and wait to make a cut or a break, and sometimes that affects the way that he attacks holes as they open. Texas has 3 offensive linemen that are going to be at the combine as well, and so it's not like that unit was a terrible blocking unit all year and he needed to be patient. There were holes for him to run through and he just wasn't taking them sometimes. And so I think he needs to be a little bit more efficient in that sense. I think his vision is maybe a little bit questionable. Again, some of that stuff of just not seeing those holes and attacking them right away. I think that there were a lot of runs that you could maybe see him bounce outside, especially with his athleticism, that he didn't necessarily take advantage of at Texas. But he's also a super young player that didn't get a ton of reps until this season because of all the guys at Texas before him. Like he was in a running back room with Bijan Robinson and Roshan Johnson and the guy on the Jaguars whose name I can't remember right now. I think it's Brian Robinson. No, Brian Robinson is the Commanders running back. You know who I'm talking about. He's on the Jaguars. But anyway, yeah. So like he's been playing behind NFL running backs basically his entire career until this season. And even this year, they were expecting him to be part of a committee until CJ Baxter got injured. And so was really just sort of a weird confluence of circumstances with him. And I really think that after this week and after he tests as well as I'm expecting him to with the top end speed and the agility that he has, I think that we're going to be talking about him a lot more as a potential, like even like late day 2 guy, early day 3 guy. Again, people that I've talked to already kind of already have him in that range, but I think you're going to see a lot more people start to talk about him in that range. And those mock draft simulator boards are going to kind of adjust to account for the fact that he tests that well in next week. Moving to wide receiver, I want to talk about Kyle Williams from Washington State. He's 5'10", 182 pounds. I thought he performed really well at the Senior Bowl. I know this is someone Steven watched recently and was a really big fan of. He's sort of starting to gain some steam a little bit because he's on that combine list, and this wide receiver class isn't necessarily the strongest at the top. I think especially for a team like the Chargers, where we've heard a lot about what their interest might be like in free agency as far as it goes with wide receiver. I think that there's a lot more discussion to be had about like a day 2 or a day 3 prospect at wide receiver to kind of fill out the room rather than a guy at the very top of the draft to be the number 1 in that room right away. And so I think Williams is a guy that you're going to see crop up a lot more as a potential Chargers pick, kind of day 2, day 3, and also just in general as kind of like everyone's new favorite day 2, day 3 wide receiver, because everyone is always trying to find the next Puka Nacua, right? Williams is not that. He's not the same type of player that Nacua is. They play a very different style of wide receiver. But I think that if you're looking for a vertical stretcher at wide receiver, which I know a lot of Chargers fans are, especially with the way that the offense operated last season, Williams is a very, very savvy vertical separator. I really like the way that he sets up his vertical routes. This is a guy who, obviously, if you guys know anything about me, I also cover the Washington Huskies. And so he's someone that I've caught a bunch of just kind of watching Wazoo ambiently in preparation for the Apple Cup, kind of keeping track of how they're doing. I really like the way that he sets up his vertical routes, and that comes from watching him over the past 2 seasons kind of live, as well as reviewing some of the tape, seeing him at the Senior Bowl. I think that that's one of the best aspects of his game. He understands zone leverage really well. I think that when you have him run routes that are crossing the field and it's zone coverage, he knows very well when to sit down, when to settle in a zone, when to give a quarterback a target. I really like that ability about him. He's a very intelligent player in that way. He does struggle a little bit as a blocker. He's only 182 pounds. He's only 5'10. He's playing on the outside. A lot of times Wazoo was lining him up as an X receiver. They have kind of a weird, it's not quite the air raid anymore, but it's effectively the air raid still with a lot more RPO stuff attached to it. Offense, but was not really the greatest blocker. Needs to find a little bit more consistency. I think his route running kind of fluctuates down to down. There's sometimes where he rounds some breaks off a little bit too much for my liking. Sometimes where he lets the ball get a little too far into his frame. But that's ultimately what makes him like a day 2 or an early day 3 prospect to me, and not like a second rounder, right? And so I think if you're looking for a vertical stretcher, you don't want to pay for a guy like Hollywood Brown or something like that. I think that this is a guy that makes some sense instead. Obviously, people are going to see the blocking line, and they're going to see that he's sort of struggles in that aspect, and they're just saying, oh, well, that's not a Harbaugh receiver. And I would disagree to some extent, because the Ravens did take Hollywood Brown in the first round. When Greg Roman was the offensive coordinator, they used him as a vertical stretcher. I think that there's a place in the offense for a guy like that. The Chargers just didn't have one last year. And so if you want to add one, I think that Williams is a great choice. Moving to tight end, Bryson Nesbitt is one of the most interesting guys I think that's going to be at the combine next week. He's 6'5", 235 pounds, and he has gone completely under the radar in this very strong tight end class because he only played the first half of the season this year. He missed the back half of the season, missed all the All-Star circuit with a wrist injury. When he got injured in October, North Carolina did say that they were expecting him to be healthy for the spring. And so I would expect that he is going to be ready to test, at least in some capacity at the combine, probably run some routes, probably do some drills. And I think that that's going to be very important for him because nobody has seen him since October. And in the meantime, obviously, we've talked about many, many, many prospects in this tight end class because it's a very good and a very deep tight end class. I think that Nesbitt is a very fluid short area athlete. He's a very creative runner after the catch. He's really more of a wide receiver. He's kind of a big slot wide receiver. Doesn't have a ton of experience blocking in line. Doesn't have a ton of experience doing like NFL tight end level stuff. And so he's going to be one of those guys like a Dalton Kincaid or like a Harold Fannin even that's in this draft class as well, where you're going to ask him to do a lot more receiving stuff early on. I think, again, the Chargers probably have a role for that guy. If you look at like the way that Isaiah Likely's blocking was viewed coming out of college, that's long been the comparison that I've used for Chargers fans that are not necessarily huge fans of drafting Fannin. I think the same thing applies to Nesbitt. I do think that Nesbitt is a little bit stiffer as a runner, which makes him a little bit more of a vertical route runner. Or like a guy that you have to get kind of on drags or something like that if you're going to use him in the short areas of the field, because he's not really a great turner. I think that Fannin kind of has that over him. I think Nesbitt's ultimately going to be a day 3 guy, but like right now, I don't even think he's on PFF's board, if I remember right. Someone that is really, really going underrated that people are talking about is like going to be a UDFA guy. I think he can probably get into like round 5, 6, 7, depending on how he does this week, at least in the eyes of the media again. Moving to the offensive line, Cincinnati guard Luke Kandra is someone that I've started to see get a little bit more love on Twitter as we get ready for the combine next week. 6'5, 318 pounds. He was at the Hula Bowl in Orlando, which is kind of the third All-Star game after the Senior Bowl and the Shrine Bowl. Has mostly played right guard, which is obviously a spot that the Chargers are anticipating to be open with the anticipated release of Trey Pipkins. He has played all three interior spots, though, so if you want him to move around a little bit, he can. I think he's a great diagnoser of stunts and twists, which is a particularly salient point for the Chargers. If you think about a certain player on the left side of the interior offensive line who has struggled with that since coming into the league. And so if you're looking for just like, that's what you want to fix, that's the only problem I want to fix, Luke Kandra. Great idea for you. He's not super heavy. He's going to come in probably sub 300 pounds, which is a little bit light for an offensive lineman, especially one in a Greg Roman scheme. Not super heavy on the raw power either. I think he's much more of a finesse player. Does have a nice little highlight reel of some knockdown blocks and stuff, but a lot of it is in space. And he ran 2/3 zone scheme in college. And so again, not necessarily going to be someone that is like a great fit for the Chargers, but as I'm sure Steven and Tyler have talked about as far as free agency goes, there's guys like Aaron Banks that have played mostly zone in San Francisco the last few years. That's going to be a free agent this year that I think would be a great gap guard because he's a super powerful player. He has a lot of traits that translate well to that scheme. I think that you can talk yourself into some traits that translate well to that scheme with Kandra as well, even though he doesn't have that same level of power. And so it's someone that I think is going to get probably into the day two conversation almost even. I think that he's like a potentially top 100 pick probably for me. And with a performance at the combine that is to expectation for what I expect, especially for like an athletic zone guard. I think that we're going to start talking about him much, much more after this week. Moving to the defensive side of the ball, Georgia Tech defensive lineman Zeke Biggers was at the Shrine Bowl at the end of January. He's 6'5", 320 pounds. Kind of got overshadowed a little bit by CJ West and Jordan Phillips being the best players at the Shrine Bowl, period. But I thought he had a couple of really nice days of practice while we were down there in Frisco. Exceptional length. I'm expecting his arms to come in over 35 inches at 6'5", which is a fantastic number. Makes him a very, very, very good two-gap player. Whether you want to play him at nose or at one tech or at three tech, he can do kind of any of those. Has done all of those at Georgia Tech. I think he's still developing a little bit as a pass rusher. Doesn't really have a ton of production there. Only had one sack this year in the ACC. Pad level can get high sometimes. I think with taller guys like that, you have this problem a lot where, especially when they start to get fatigued, which the NFL is going to use him as a much more rotational player than Georgia Tech used him because he's the best player on Georgia Tech. He will probably not be the best player on an NFL defensive line. But as you start to get fatigued, your pad level starts to get a little bit higher. When you're a taller guy like Biggers is at 6'5", that starts to show up even more because then it's a little bit easier to block you when you're that high up. Low man wins, as we all know, et cetera, et cetera. But I think that he's a really great day three option. This defensive tackle class is loaded, as evidenced by the fact that there's like 30 of them that got invited to the combine this year. So there's a lot of other guys that you could pick here. I think Peyton Page at Clemson is another one that kind of showed out at the Shrine Bowl a little bit that I'm intrigued to see in this setting. Obviously, what I mentioned, CJ West and Jordan Phillips, I think both of them are going to pop off a little bit more. But Biggers is kind of my like deeper sleeper name for a guy that I think goes day three. I think if you're expecting Poona Ford and or Tierra Tart to be back for the Chargers, day three is probably where you're going to be looking for a depth addition. I do think that there's still an argument to be made that the Chargers should add a defensive lineman of some kind, whether that's a tackle or a edge player in the first 2 days of the draft. But if you want to wait until like round 5 or 6, maybe, I think Biggers is still a very talented player that has a lot of development room still to grow. Moving to the edge, I want to talk about Oluwafemi Oladejo. I think I got that one. We'll find out this week because I'm sure I will speak to him a little bit and I'll get the pronunciation. Wow, I got the name and then I can't do pronunciation. That's crazy. But I'll get the pronunciation of his name down. He's 6'3", 261 pounds. Really popped at the Senior Bowl this year. I think was someone that like UCLA wasn't very good, and so there's not a lot of people watching the UCLA tape during the season, except for me because they played UW earlier in the year, and so I did watch a game or two to prepare for that game. Ended up being senior night for UW. They got bowl eligible with a win over UCLA in that one, so that was very nice. But Oladejo really had a breakout season this year for UCLA because they moved him to the edge, where he had not played before 2024. Maybe a little bit in 2023, but he hadn't played it before he got to UCLA, certainly. He started out as an off-ball linebacker at Cal. I think that those instincts flash when you watch his tape because he is a great run defender in space. I think that he's still dealing a little bit with the adjustment to being a great run defender in a phone booth, right? I think that sometimes he gets a little bit too aggressive when a guard pulls away from him or when a guard is pulling towards him and he's kind of like late to get blocked. I think he drifts downfield a little bit too much because he's used to playing linebacker, and so he's used to being more of a penetrator in those situations. When you're playing on the edge, you want to be more of a contained player. You want to keep the gap integrity intact. And so that part of his game is still developing a little bit, but when he is in space and he is truly unblocked, he's a fantastic run defender. I think his hands are super violent, super active. He shows a pretty well developed pass rush plan for being so inexperienced on the edge. He has a cross chop move that he really likes, that he's brought out a ton, that I think is really effective and probably will continue to be really effective in the NFL. That's one of my favorite NFL pass rush moves. I think it translates very, very well in general. He does get countered with length a lot of the time. Part of that is just that I think that he is still setting up his pass rush moves a little bit too early sometimes. And so he's giving offensive linemen a little bit more of a target where they can kind of swat his hand away and then get into his chest, get into his frame, and really latch onto him. And then he doesn't really have a great counter plan yet because he's only been playing edge for a maximum of like 18 months. Uh, and so, for all of those reasons, there's probably an argument to be made that just off traits alone, you could take this guy on day two, develop him into a potential like all pro down the line. Do I think that that's realistic? Not necessarily. I think that it's probably much more likely that he goes probably middle of day three sometime. I would say maybe the end of the fourth, but probably like fifth or sixth, unless he like really pops off the screen this week, which is totally possible. He totally could do that, and then I will have to adjust because that adjustment goes both ways, right? But if he does do that, that's going to be awesome. I really like him. I think that if you are anticipating that Khalil Mack is going to be back on the Chargers and that Bud Dupree is going to be back for the Chargers, you are looking for at minimum, or I guess maximum, an edge 4, right? In that scenario, edge 5 if Joey Bosa also comes back, because obviously you have Tuli Tuipulotu as well. I know most people are not expecting Bosa to be back. I do still think there's a world where they do some cap adjustment to his contract of some sort, especially with the cap coming in so high over expectation as of yesterday. So I think there is a world where they probably do something to keep him still, but regardless, you're looking for a developmental guy. If you keep one of Mac or Bosa and then also have Bud Dupree coming into training camp, you're looking for a developmental guy that's going to come in, play like 10, 15 snaps a game. I think Oladejo is a great option for that because I think that there's a lot of traits to work with. Obviously, Chargers just hired a new edge coach that they promoted from within, Dylan Roney, that has done a great job so far working with that defensive unit. So obviously they trust what they have there. And I think Oladejo is a potential gem depending on how everything works out this week. Moving to the secondary, Kansas State corner Jacob Parrish, I think, has been kind of battered around a little bit as as everyone's favorite day two sleeper corner that nobody wants to actually talk about. Like he's on a lot of lists and there's not a lot of like actual like analysis of his game anywhere, at least that I've seen recently. He's only 5'10", 196 pounds. Was at the Senior Bowl. I thought he played pretty well there. Was mostly working out of the slot in the Senior Bowl. I think that probably is his best NFL fit. Daniel Jeremiah, again, who had that conference call earlier today as I record this, did mention him as like a slot defender that he really likes kind of on day two. I think that there's a lot of things that make sense about that. Parrish is a great click and close player. He has a really quick trigger. He's a very, very good disruptor of passing windows. He gets his hands in there. He's very physical. He is a little bit undersized. And so if you want to make use of that physicality, you probably do need to kick him inside. I totally get all of that. But also, I see someone that when you put him in zone, Kansas State put him in zone coverage fairly often from the outside. And I thought that he did a really, really nice job of tricking quarterbacks into making dangerous throws, where he's sort of almost showing one zone but playing another sometimes. And I thought he did that really well as a really good setup player. I do think that like the fact that he's going to be a slot corner probably in the eyes of most NFL teams does sort of limit how high he can get as far as draft prospect. I'm kind of expecting a top 100 pick right now, which is roughly the first top 3 rounds. I would say probably closer to 100 than to 50. So probably a third rounder somewhere in there. But if you're the Chargers and you think that you can play Tarheeb still on the outside full time, which we've discussed on the show before that I think that Tarheeb is probably the best suited in the nickel, but the Chargers might feel differently about that. I don't know exactly where they stand on that process. So if you want to draft a new nickel instead, you could take Parrish, put him in the nickel. I think he's not the greatest run defender, either from the nickel or from outside, and so there might be a little bit of a fit issue there. But if you're just looking for like lockdown coverage out of the slot, it's becoming more and more important in the NFL. You got to take some concessions sometimes where you can get them. I think that still makes a lot of sense as a potential option. And I think that he's someone that's going to enter the zeitgeist a little bit more. And, you're going to start seeing him on even more lists of like, is this guy secretly the best corner in the draft or, whatever those NFL rookie watch accounts do. Anyway, lastly, we're going to go with Iowa State safety Malik. I think it's Verdon. I don't know. I don't know how French he wants to be. He's 6'4", 220 pounds. Missed the Senior Bowl with an arm injury. He played the last month of the season this year with a hairline fracture in his arm that he finally got fixed after the season ended. And so he did miss the Senior Bowl, was invited to come. And that's kind of the book on him is he has missed time in 2022 and 2023 with injury. And now didn't miss any time, but did miss the All-Star circuit with another injury, right? And so obviously like a hairline fracture is a little bit different. I don't know exactly what the injuries were in 2022 and 2023. I'm kind of still working through his background profile and everything as we get ready for next week. But hairline fractures, like I'm not super concerned for risk of re-injury there. I think like anytime that is a soft tissue injury, you're a lot more concerned for like what that means in terms of longevity, with that sort of thing. Like Steven has talked about this kind of in the same vein with like a guy like Chris Godwin who has a fractured ankle. Not super worried about that being like a long-term affecting injury for him because it's not any soft tissue damage. It's just like the bone is broken. Your bones heal. Your soft tissue doesn't necessarily heal as well. And so still need to figure out what those other two injuries were. But anyway, basically he broke his arm. He's a super quick trigger in run defense. I think he's very aggressive there. Usually used more as like a box safety. Sometimes as a little bit of a too high guy. I think he's a great, great, great coverage guy against tight ends. Against slot receivers, not so much. I'm not the biggest fan of the way that he moves in space all the time. I think that also limits how much you're going to be able to play him as like a true center fielder at safety. But that's fine because you can just play him in the box. You can play him as like a big nickel kind of dime backer, the same way that the Chargers used Derwin James. I do think he needs to clean up some of his tackling technique a little bit. He wants to like make a big hit on every play, but that kind of in doing so, he sacrifices technique sometimes. Want to see him clean that up just a little bit. But I think for the Chargers, right, who just re-signed Elijah Molden earlier this evening, You have Elijah Molden, you have Alohi Gilman, you have Derwin James coming into next year. Tony Jefferson is back also. So that room is pretty much filled out. But if you want to take a shot on a guy like Verdon, day 3, right? Like probably pretty late day 3, and have him be essentially the understudy to Derwin James, where if and when Derwin gets hurt and has to miss time, you can slot a guy into that role and you can still be able to do some of the things that Jesse Minter wants to be able to do on defense. Is there going to be a drop off in that? Of course. Derwin James was an all pro this season, but they don't really have a guy on the roster that can even like stand in that role and force the defense to at least like think for a split second about that look, right? Like right now, when Derwin comes off the field, they don't have someone that can play that role. And so if you want someone that can play that role, I think Verdon makes a lot of sense as someone who you can mold into that sort of player because he already is a pretty proficient dime backer in college. Iowa State runs a 3-3-5, and so that third safety oftentimes is a box player that is effectively a linebacker, and that's effectively what you'd be asking him to do in a lot of situations with Derwin off the field. Obviously, some of the coverage stuff would need to get cleaned up a little bit, but again, it's day 3. You're taking some concessions on guys, projecting some guys a little bit. So I think someone that could potentially start to work his way into Chargers mock drafts, depending on how next week goes for him. That's going to do it for this week, guys. I will maybe be back while I'm in Indianapolis, record with some people live and in person, just talking about the class overall. I'll have to workshop that a little bit with some people. I will be deep in the trenches of Prime 47, probably blasted at 2 a.m. pitching videos to people. So we'll see how it goes. But I'm super excited. I hope you guys are too. I know there's going to be a ton of great content that comes out of this week. Last year, I got to ask Joe out about flipping to right tackle before the Chargers drafted him. I got plenty of inside news that I dropped in the Guilty as Charged Discord, which if you guys are not in there, you're going to want to get in there so that you get all of that news because I don't report most of it publicly. So get in there. Join the 2025 NFL Draft Discussion channel on there. That's where I post all the stuff that's happening with me. And again, if you want to follow just all my work that I'm doing over the course of this next couple of months while we get ready for the draft, find me on social media at Alex Katson, the same way you see it spelled on the screen. On Blue Sky, it's just at Katson, Katson. You can also go to my new website, alexkatson.com, that has all of my stuff on it. Until then, I will see you guys soon. I hope you are as stoked for the combine as I am, and bolt up.